So I'd like to call to the floor to our next speakers to learn as much as possible about blockchain. Hulda, take your people and come here, my dear. It's your turn. You start?
Yes. Thank you. Okay, welcome to the workshop on lifecycle management and digital preservation using blockchain technology. I'm Victoria Lemieux, and I'm from the University of British Columbia. I'll be giving a talk here in a moment. So that's me from 10 to 10:30. We'll then have our coffee break, which is when we're no longer free, or you're free. You're free of me anyway. Then we'll move into the presentation section of the workshop, which is going to be led by Lars Hansen, talking about a tool to control digital content. Then we'll move into blockchain and the Austrian data market project, presented by Ross King. Ross, are you? Yes, hello. With some of us, we haven't met all of us before, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm kind of looking around for everyone. Then Kolder As from the Estonian National Archives, my co-program chair, who is up there. He waved, and he'll present, followed by Hervé Stanček. Of the University of Zagreb, Blockchain in the Archives. And so then we'll move into our panel discussion, which is going to be from 12:10 to 1 o'clock. Depending on how each speaker's been given about a 20-minute slot, and depending how much time they use of that, then we'll have time for questions and answers in just following the presentations. If we're running a little short, I'm going to ask you to note down your questions, and these will be questions that we can come back to then in the panel discussion at the end. Okay, so without further ado then, if I go out of here, I will be able to load up my presentation. Okay. All right. So we're here because Kolder and I, just a little bit of history. Kolder and I met earlier in the spring. I guess it was way back in May, to talk about how the Estonian government was using blockchain technology as part of a project that I'm working on, and we began to think we should really draw together experts in the digital preservation field, archival experts, to talk about this, because we noted that blockchain technology is now actively being used for record-keeping applications, which means that as archivists and those concerned with digital preservation, this is the reality of record-keeping that we're going to have to deal with. So, as prefaced by John Sheridan, it's a brave new world out there. We can't hide our heads in the sand. We have to adapt. We have to learn and understand about this technology in order to be able to create the conditions where it can actually be preserved. In addition, we saw potential to innovate our own practices with this technology. So it's all of these things that we want to really reflect on today. So we are indeed moving into a networked, decentralized, and autonomous global future. And the blockchain technology is really only one instantiation of that future. So it began with the internet, and it represented a major shift in our socio-material world on the order of the Industrial Revolution. The World Economic Forum calls it the fourth Industrial Revolution, or something like that. We're entering a phase where the means of production are rapidly changing, and that is, it's networked. So it's no longer sort of the hierarchical world that we're used to of organizational structure or information structure. It's network, it's graphed, it's also autonomous, combining AI with the networked, and it's also distributed and global. And that's blockchain in a nutshell. So I thought for those who may not be fully familiar with blockchain technology, that it would be really useful to give you a bit of an overview of some of the key concepts. And this is a project that I've been working on as part of the International Standards Organization's Technical Committee 307, in case you want to know the number, on blockchain and distributed ledger technology. So these discussions are going on now. The study group on reference architecture, concepts, and taxonomy has been meeting over the summer. I've just been appointed International Project Manager for Blockchain Terminology. We'll be starting our work very soon. So it's all kicking off this world of standards in blockchain technology, even while the technology is still emerging. And so it's very challenging. So let me review some general concepts here and types of, including types of distributed ledger systems, the idea of consensus, roles, applications, and services. So blockchain technology is referred to as a type of distributed ledger technology in which confirmed and validated sets of transactions are held in blocks. And the blocks, so look, chunks, sets of data. And the blocks are linked or chained together in a way that makes tampering difficult and allows our participant to append additional blocks in a sequential manner. So each chain starts with an original block. It's called a genesis block. And each of the genesis block is followed by more blocks in a time-ordered sequence, wherein each block contains a hash being a 256 right now, a 256-bit random number that is computationally generated from any size of input information. So you could have the whole National Archives, the digital holdings of the National Archives, reduced down to 256-bit number, potentially. So this is combined, this hash, with the hash of the prior block in the chain to create this linked data structure. And this forms a long, continuous chain of hashes, hence the name blockchain. The length of the blockchain is referred to as the block height. That's the distance between the very first block, the genesis block, and the last block in the chain. Now, within each of these blocks, there are sets of records of transactions. The records of transactions within the blocks represent a series of actions that involve units of value, like cryptocurrency, like Bitcoin, if you've all heard of that. Or it represents an asset, a representation, or a tokenization of land or other assets. That's often known generically as a token. So there can be coins or tokens, but they're all just representations of units of value or some kind of asset. Now, the transactions result in some kind of a state change to the unit of value or the transaction. So a payment of a coin from one wallet to another, or a change in ownership of an asset like land that's been tokenized and represented on the blockchain. So a state change, and that's essentially what business transactions are all about, initiating state change in the world. Records of transactions are created by taking input information about the unit of value or asset and then digitally signing it to produce a hash. So we have digital signatures over all the transactions. Now, in order to avoid a situation where a participant on this distributed network called blockchain could spend a coin twice or transfer ownership of an asset like land twice, which is called the problem of double spending in Bitcoin terms, records of transactions are broadcast out to through this distributed network. So in the Bitcoin network, there's something like between 5,000, nobody knows exactly for sure, but 5,000 to 6,000 nodes on the network. That's individual computers that are operating together to produce the compute power that processes these transactions. And other networks have different numbers of nodes. Ethereum, it's actually much higher than the Bitcoin network. It's in the area of 20,000 independent nodes. So this creates a distributed peer-to-peer, which means that each of these nodes can communicate directly with the other one, mesh computing network. And this is why blockchain technology is often called a distributed ledger, because it's distributed out to all these nodes. So as John was mentioning, there's this massive redundancy, because each one of these nodes has a copy of the ledger. Some of them have a complete copy of the ledger. So all of the transactions and all of the blocks are found in all of these different nodes or computers. Or some of them are called light nodes. They have a truncated version, a partial version of this distributed ledger, all the transactions and all the blocks. And the reason for this is because if this redundancy creates a situation where you can tell if the data has changed, if something on the ledger has changed or been tampered with, because they should all match up through the use of cryptography. I'll explain a bit more about that. And if there's some way in which the ledger doesn't match up, one of the nodes has some kind of different information, you can tell very easily because it's very obvious that it doesn't match up with all the other nodes. So that's the power of redundancy in play here in the blockchain in a distributed fashion. So nodes in the network collect the broadcasts of those transactions that I spoke about, those records of transactions, into blocks. The blocks are then hashed. The hash of the block is actually only the hash of a block header, a piece of data that contains a timestamp. The timestamp establishes the sequential order in which each transaction is entered into the block. This is important. And then because each block then is linked together in this time-ordered fashion, and if you go back and you try to change something earlier on in the block, a transaction record to indicate, I sent you 100 pounds instead of 10 pounds, let's say for the sake of argument, it's going to be evident because the hash is not going to match up, the copies on all the nodes, the particular node that you're trying to change is not going to match up, and so it's going to be apparent that something's been tampered with. The timestamp, though, is a system-generated timestamp. It's important to note, and not real calendar time. So in many blockchain solutions, there's an additional step where the block hash is actually recorded in, say, a newspaper, so you can link it to real calendar time, human time. Okay, so when the block reaches its maximum size, because each block has a limit to its size, there's been a big debate in the blockchain, Bitcoin blockchain community over the block size recently, which has led to a split in the blockchain network, a fork it's called. When these blocks reach their size, though, they're linked together cryptographically. So this is done by adding hashes of all transactions into the new block of the hash of the previous block, as I mentioned before, which produces the new block hash. And that block hash is subsequently added to all the transaction hashes of the succeeding block. So everything's hashed together. So all the input data is reduced to a 256-bit number. Then it's linked to the previous block. The hash of the previous block is hashed with the new hash of the transactions in the new block. That's hashed together to create a block hash, and the process repeats. So a lot of hashing. It's a giant hash. And so this hash, they're all linked together, and there's a process called a consensus mechanism to achieve agreement on the validity of the records in the transaction. Okay, so the consensus mechanism. In the Bitcoin, this is proof of work mechanism. So there's a computational puzzle that has to be solved. It generates a lot of, requires a lot of compute power and requires a lot of energy. But there's other kinds of consensus mechanisms. So the consensus mechanism is designed to ensure that updates to the blockchain are agreed and communicated across the entire network in a transparent manner. Okay, so it works to get agreement that, okay, this transaction was recorded at this specific time and it's a valid transaction. And this allows the establishment of the order in which the records of transactions are entered onto the blockchain, and that the transaction is undisputed, so that if there's any changes to what's written on the blockchain, it can be detected. Once these transactions are written to the blockchain in these blocks that are hashed together, they're meant to be immutable. So that means they should be stable and unchanging. Now, there's, of course, things that can happen that make that untrue, but the intention is that they should be immutable. So, again, there's different types of consensus mechanisms. There's proof of stake, there's practical Byzantine fault tolerance, proof of authority. All of these different consensus mechanisms make the nodes on the network behave slightly differently, because each of them have a different reward or incentive scheme underpinning them. So a reward or an incentive mechanism is considered as a consideration, such as a payment, given to a party for undertaking some activity within the blockchain system. So like validation of the transactions, you get a bit of a reward. An example is in the proof of work consensus mechanism that's used in Bitcoin and also in Ethereum. They operate slightly differently, but in general, you have these nodes or groups of nodes called miners, and they solve this cryptographic puzzle, and for doing that, they get a financial reward. They get a little bit of Bitcoin, or they get a little bit of Ether in the Ethereum network. And that makes them actually perform their work. And that's how the network is sustained. And that's how the validation of transactions is done. Once validation by means of the consensus mechanisms is complete, each node will receive an update to its copy of the ledger, which reflects that a certain amount of value has been deducted from the value of one wallet, let's say, on the network, and attributed to another wallet on the network. Now, this idea of wallets, really, these are just addresses on the network. So, like in the internet, we have IP addresses. The wallet performs a similar function. And what it really is it's an address, but it's also a public key. A public key is something that it's again a hash, this 256-bit number, that functions like a postal code or an address. So it's where you send your transaction. And for each public key, you have a key pair, a matching key, which is a private key. So this is public, it uses public key cryptography, where you have a public key and a private key. So think of a postbox, which is your public key, that's the address, and then you have a key to your postbox, which is your private key to help you unlock what's in your postbox, okay? So the person who holds the private key controls the wallet and what's in it, just like in a postbox. If you have the key to the postbox, you control what's in it, the post that's received, and you can open up the postbox and do things with what's in it. But in the blockchain world, since there's nothing inherent in the operation of the blockchain that links a person's real-world identity to their private key, so in a postal system, probably your key to your postbox list is linked to your name somewhere and your real-world identity. But that's not necessarily true in the blockchain world. And that's why it's popular. That's why it's considered pseudonymous. So it's not anonymous, but it's pseudonymous. And that's also why it's become popular with those involved with criminal activities, because you can make and receive payments without detection, or in theory. The association with criminal activity has led many to eschew the use of blockchain technology, but now law enforcement agencies and others have techniques that are using sophisticated machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques to actually analyze transactions and link those transactions to real-world identities. So the problem isn't completely solved, but there are techniques for doing it. Okay, so in addition to being a distributed network, blockchains are also potentially decentralized systems. Okay, so that is that nodes do not operate under the central control of a centralized server, for example, or a centralized authority, but they are independent, albeit operating in a coordinated fashion through the consensus mechanisms. And so governance may also be decentralized, so they don't operate under a single organization or an entity. Bitcoin would be an example of that, Ethereum. In some cases, though, they do. They operate under a consortium type of arrangement. And in this case, we generally consider them to be private or permissioned blockchains versus public blockchains. So private and permission blockchains are not decentralized in the same way as public. They're distributed, but not decentralized. That's an important distinction. Public blockchains are often permissionless as well. That is, participants do not require a special authorization or authentication to access, read, write, or participate in transactions in the consensus process. And because participants do not need special authorization or authentication to review transactions on a public blockchains are also said to provide transparency and traceability. And I think that there's many other things that I could mention about the applications and services, but one of the most important, and then I'll leave it at that, are smart contracts. So smart contracts are programmable contracts or applications that run over a blockchain and express business logic associated with a transaction, and they execute on the blockchain platform. And they originally were associated with the Ethereum blockchain, but now the Bitcoin blockchain, Hyperledger, many blockchain platforms actually have smart contract capability. Through the use of smart contracts, you can create contractual clauses that may be partially or fully self-executing, self-enforcing, or both. And so the outcome of smart contracts may or may not be legally binding, though. So just because a smart contract executes, the transfer of say, stock or, some kind of an asset does not mean that the law recognizes that transfer. So if I used a smart contract to sell you a piece of property, doesn't necessarily mean that sale is legally recognized. There's also many related services that blockchains access. They can access off-chain services like centralized databases, cloud data stores, or even distributed data stores like the BitTorrent network or the interplanetary file system. So there's this ecosystem emerging around blockchain technology. So those are the central concepts that we're discussing within the International Standards Organization, TC 307 on blockchain. That's kind of blockchain 101. It's a lot to take in if you've never been exposed to blockchain technology before. There are resources, there's places where you can go to find out more about how blockchain operates. We can't do like a full blockchain 101 in this session, obviously, But if you want to come and talk to me afterwards, I can point you in the direction of some more resources. So the interesting thing about blockchain is that even though the first use case is the Bitcoin blockchain, that paper came out synonymously authored by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009. Nobody knows who that is, actually, still to this very day. It's not just useful for cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. It is now increasingly being used for record keeping, as I mentioned, in e-health, land transactions, identity management, financial record keeping, and so on. But it's extremely hyped up. So there's a lot of talk about, blockchain, the new trusted record keeping solution. Blockchain, the new global archives. So back in 2015, when I first started to read about this, I said, well, hey, wait a minute. I'm an archival scientist, and this is a technology that at its core is a record keeping technology. It's a ledger, a distributed ledger. I said, this is a job for an archival scientist. What can we find out about this technology? Is it really true that it's the new global archives? So I started to investigate. How do we know what we can trust on the blockchain? How do we know if it will remain immutable? Is it really going to do what it says on the box? And I said, how would we evaluate this? How do we know? Do we just sort of hang around and wait to see what happens? So that's not really a good idea because of the risks involved. They're fairly significant. So I said, well, it's a record-keeping technology. Let's apply an archival science theoretical framework. So I drew upon the work of the Inter Pares project, which is a 25-year project investigating long-term preservation of authentic records. Of course, that project draws on archival theory that is centuries old, and some of those scholars John mentioned in his talk. We have a taxonomy of what it takes to trust records that incorporates accuracy, reliability, and authenticity as the main components, all of which properties have to persist through space and time. I won't go into detail on that, but I have been working on a project called Records in the Chain and analyzing how blockchain is being used for record keeping. I've looked at a proposed pilot in Honduras for land transactions. I've worked with Calder, who will speak about the Estonian e-health, which is a guard time-based solution. I'm currently looking at Brazil land transaction recording with Ubiquity, and have also looked at the use of blockchain for land transactions in Sweden, which is a ChromaWay solution. And what I've found is that blockchain is great in the area of integrity, which is a small part of authenticity. That's really, it's the core. All of these hashes are checks on the integrity of records, so we can ensure that the record is complete after creation. Even so, it does only focus largely on bit stream completion. And as John alluded to, we need to look beyond that, because with records, it's not just about the bit stream, it's about the meaning of the content and how that links back to the transactional nature of the record. And that we typically capture in something called the archival bond, which is the link of the record to the business transaction. And that's a big red alert in blockchain. Most blockchain solutions do not do that well. They're not being designed to do that. And so that's an area that needs further concentration. And all those other areas in yellow may or may not be considered. So there's a lot of work to do. And the opportunity, just going to quickly to my SWOT analysis, the opportunity for us as archives and records professionals, those involved in digital preservation, is that we can imbue this new technology, because it's still emerging, with our theories and principles, so we can create the conditions for long-term preservation of authentic records. But the threat is, and John alluded to this too, is if we lack the skills, if we lack the knowledge, and we're slow to respond, we need to be really, really proactive. And so I've been advocating for a kind of a computational archival scientist, which, has the skills for the digital world and combines that with theoretical knowledge of the archival scientists. Because I don't think that what we've done in the past, and I loved what John had to say, applying our kind of archival paper minds to the digital world has really been working for us. We need a much more deeper and meaningful interdisciplinary integration of the two perspectives to prepare ourselves for this brave new world of distributed, autonomous, global digital preservation. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, because there's many more interesting talks for us to hear about.